Cyberpunk 2077 is coming to the Switch 2, and that alone raises a lot of questions. This is a game that once struggled to run on last-gen consoles, so how exactly is it supposed to work on a handheld? Today, we're putting the Switch 2 version side by side with the PS4 Pro, the PS5, and the PS5 Pro. From visuals to performance and everything in between, we're breaking down what each version gets right and where they fall short. So let's get right into it. Now, let's take a look at Cyberpunk 2077 on the PS4 Pro. You might expect the PS4 Pro to perform better than the Switch 2, but surprisingly, that's not what we're seeing here. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Looking closely at the PS4 Pro version, you can see that the textures look a bit duller, and the lighting doesn't stand out as much in some areas. Shadows feel softer, and the overall image can come across as a little flat. The desert environment doesn't have the same sharp detail. It looks more blurred and less defined compared to what we've seen on the Switch 2. Even the reflections on cars and other shiny surfaces seem more faded, missing that extra layer of polish that helps bring scenes to life. As we transition to the Switch 2 footage, the initial impression is a noticeable leap in visual fidelity. Looking at this first scene, the level of detail on the characters and the surrounding environment is clearly enhanced. You can see that even the distant landscapes retain a good degree of definition. In these closer character moments, the textures on clothing and skin appear sharper. And as we move through these different environments, the lighting consistently adds more depth and richness to the scenes, creating a more immersive feel overall. It's evident the Switch 2 is aiming for a significantly more detailed Cyberpunk experience. So here's Cyberpunk 2077 on the PS4 Pro. Notice the somewhat softer textures and the less dynamic lighting. Now, as we transition to the Switch 2 version in the exact same spot, the difference is striking. The textures become noticeably sharper, revealing more detail in the character's clothing and the environment. The lighting also appears richer, adding depth and a greater sense of realism to the scene. Even the reflections on surfaces seem more pronounced on the Switch 2. Now, let's get a closer look at the character detail. Here's the same scene rendered on the PS4 Pro. You can observe a certain softness in the facial features, the cybernetic enhancements, and the textures of the clothing. As we transition to the Switch 2 version, the immediate impression is a significant increase in sharpness and definition. The details in the character's face, the intricate lines of the cybernetics, and the texture of the jacket all appear much more distinct and refined on the Switch 2. The jump from PS4 Pro to Switch 2 is impressive, but how does true next-gen power factor in? We'll take a look at the PlayStation 5 next, and you won't believe the difference in lighting. Here's the scene as it appears on the PS4 Pro. Notice the slightly softer details and less pronounced lighting. Now, switching to the Switch 2 version, the difference is clear. Johnny's clothing and the cybernetic details show a noticeable jump in sharpness. The lighting creates more depth, and overall, the image has a greater sense of clarity and detail. Here we have the diner scene on the PS4 Pro. Notice the overall image clarity and the detail in elements like Johnny's leather pants and the waitress's uniform. Now, as we switch to the Switch 2 version, you can see a subtle but noticeable improvement in sharpness and detail. The textures on the clothing, the reflections on the floor, and even the neon signs in the background appear a touch more defined, contributing to a slightly richer visual experience. Stepping into the Afterlife bar, we first see it on the PS4 Pro. Notice the overall atmosphere and the glow of the neon lights. Now, as we transition to the Switch 2 version, the scene appears to gain a bit more visual clarity. The neon signs and the holographic elements seem to emit a slightly more vibrant glow, and the details in the environment, like the textures on the floor and the bar itself, appear a bit more sharper, contributing to a more visually distinct and atmospheric presentation. Now we move to the open expanse of the Badlands. On the PS4 Pro, the environment appears somewhat flatter, with less distinct detail in the distant mountains and the desert floor. As we switch to the Switch 2 version, you can observe a noticeable increase in the sharpness of the terrain textures, and the distant mountain range gains more definition. Even the vegetation and the vehicles seem to have a slightly higher level of detail, contributing to a more visually rich and expansive outdoor environment. Now then, let's move on to comparing Cyberpunk 2077 on the Switch 2 and the PS5, but before we dive in, if you've made it this far into the video, take a second to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and drop a like to help support the channel. It really goes a long way and helps keep videos like this coming your way. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that the results were surprising, and here's exactly why. On paper, the Switch 2 shouldn't even be in the same conversation as the PS5. Based purely on hardware specs, it's expected to perform closer to a PlayStation 4, maybe slightly better, but definitely not next-gen. That's why what we're seeing here is so unexpected. Not only did the Switch 2 hold its own, it actually outperformed the PS4 Pro in several key areas. But what's even more shocking. It managed to match the PS5 in visual quality across many scenes. We're talking about similar lighting effects, texture quality, even resolution, and performance stability in certain gameplay segments. That alone is a huge leap. You're now getting a PS5 level experience, but on a handheld device. Notice how the light from the window spills into the room and interacts with the surfaces. As we transition to the Switch 2 version, overall the scene composition remains similar. Here's the bustling street scene rendered on the PlayStation 5. Notice the level of detail in the textures of the characters' clothing, neon signs, and the overall clarity of the image. As we transition to the Switch 2 version, while the core scene remains, you can observe a slight reduction in the sharpness of some textures. The textures might not have the same microscopic level of clarity, and the subtle differences in the lighting might be less obvious compared to the PS5 Pro's advanced capabilities. Alright, let's get a good look at this character's face. On the PlayStation 5 Pro, you can see really tiny details, like the small lines on their skin and the sharp edges of those metal parts. Even the fabric of their jacket looks very real. Now, when we switch to the Switch 2, you can still see a lot of detail, but those super tiny lines on the skin aren't quite as clear, and the edges of the metal might look a little softer. The jacket still looks good, but maybe not quite as much like real fabric up close. Overall, the Switch 2 still shows a lot, but the PS5 Pro has that extra bit of fine detail. Now, let's take a look at this same scene on the PlayStation 5. Notice how the light from the ceiling fan casts a soft glow on Johnny and across the room, creating subtle, realistic shadows. The details on his metal arm and leather pants come through clearly, with a high level of texture fidelity. Switching over to the Switch 2 version, the lighting still maintains the same atmospheric tone, but the shadows are slightly less refined. There's a minor drop in texture sharpness, and the overall lighting isn't quite as smooth, but here's the thing, it's remarkably close. Despite being a handheld device, the Switch 2 delivers a scene that feels almost on par with the PS5. The differences are there if you look closely, but the fact that it's even in the same conversation is genuinely impressive. Let's take a closer look at Solomon Reed's face in this scene. On the PlayStation 5, you can clearly see the fine details in his skin, subtle textures, facial contours, and even the reflective finish on his jacket. The necklace and watch also stand out, with crisp highlights and intricate surface detail that really sell the realism. Now, shifting over to the Switch 2 version, Reed still looks like himself. The character model holds up well, but some of those finer details don't come through quite as sharply. The jacket's shine is still present, just not as pronounced, and the smaller elements like his jewelry appear slightly softer. That said, the overall presentation is still strong. While the PS5 edges ahead in texture fidelity and polish, the fact that the Switch 2 delivers such a close visual result, again, on a handheld, is seriously impressive. And that brings us to the end of our comparison between Cyberpunk 2077 on the Switch 2, the PS4 Pro, and the PlayStation 5. Of course, the PS5 still takes the lead when it comes to finer detail, lighting precision, and overall performance. But what the Switch 2 achieves here, especially in a portable form factor, is genuinely remarkable. If you found this breakdown useful, make sure to hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe for more detailed comparisons and deep dives like this. Got thoughts on how the Switch 2 stacks up against the PS4 Pro or PS5? Let's talk about it in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.